And thank you, Steve, and thanks, Dave, for inviting me. It means a great deal to me to speak to the Socialist History Society. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's lovely to see people that I know in the audience vaguely. I can't see you all. It's just really moving to be able to share this with you. So normally when I give these talks, I start out by asking who has heard of the German Peasants' War, and usually nobody has. But in this case, I don't think that's going to be true. Have most of you heard of the German Peasants' War of 1525, or depending on how you date it, 1524 to 6? And usually people's eyes glaze over at this point, and this started to get to me. So I thought, actually, what I need to explain is why the German Peasants' War is so important and what it has to tell us now. So that's why I've called this, Why Should We Care About the German Peasants' War? And I would say that we should care about it because, as Greta just said, it was the biggest popular uprising in Western Europe before the French Revolution. And if we look at the map, uh, Steve, we should be able to see. Steve is now turned into an owl, but I think that, yeah, there we are. And I'm
Excellent.
sorry, it's got German titles. I got stuck in a meeting and wasn't able to change the headings to English. We should care because if you look, you can see that it stretched from Switzerland and southwest Germany right up through Alsace, through Swabia and Franconia, and up through Thuringia and Saxony, and over to Austria and Tyrol. So if you thought about that today, that's five present day European countries. And even more amazing, we know that over 600 monasteries and convents were attacked and threatened, many burnt to the ground, and I'll come on to that later. Hundreds of castles were destroyed as the peasants simply flattened the towers of lordship. We'll never know how many people were killed during the course of the conflict, but I guess it's somewhere between 70 and 100,000 people. That is colossal, and most of them were the rebels, not those on the authorities' side. And of course, if that many people died, many more will have taken part. So we should care about it because it's huge. And we should care about it too because it happened in the middle of the German Reformation and it changed the Reformation forever. So that's the point at which what had been in Western Europe a united Christendom splits into Catholicism and Protestantism when Martin Luther began to critique the Catholic Church and the Reformation began. So I'm a historian of Germany and I've written a biography of Martin Luther. So if you like, the Peasants' War has loomed over my entire scholarly career. So I felt I've actually got to confront it. Last year was the 500th anniversary of it. And so nearly 10 years ago now, I decided to write a book about it. And I found writing this book a great challenge. I have never done anything on time before. I was 8 years late with my Luther biography, and I knew that this book could not be late. So taking it on meant I had a hard deadline. And then I'm really bad at reading maps or even knowing where I am, and I can't remember dates. I'm a historian who knows how to focus in, but focusing out is another matter, and I find it quite hard. So this book was the biggest challenge that I could possibly set myself as a historian. So I was convinced that the landscape had to be part of it. So how did I start? Well, I began by buying a bicycle and cycling from the town of Mühlhausen to Frankenhausen. And that's the route that the peasant leader Thomas Müntzer took to the battle at Frankenhausen. So I got there. It was a Friday evening. My train was late and it was a holiday weekend. So I bought a bicycle, but the bike shop didn't have any maps. Oh, well, I thought I'll just follow the signs. So if we have a look at the next slide, um, if, as you will all well know, in Germany, you can cycle a bicycle path without a map. Maybe you don't all know that, but you do know that now. You can do that, but there's just one problem. The signs are instantly recognizable. They're green and they have a little bicycle on them, but you need to know what the next village is. And I didn't. Needless to say, I got hopelessly lost in the woods, and here is about the last point where I knew where I was. I ended up cycling down a very steep, very stony, completely impossible path. But I learnt so much from retracing the rebels' route and seeing, if we look at the next slide, I came across places like this, what's left at Schlotheim. And if you look at that, you can see it's a sort of pink, Baroque, beautiful building on top. And then it's got this huge ditch. And actually, that's because it's a castle, and what you're seeing is a big ditch, and the 18th century building has just been put on top. Or if we look at the next one, I saw the ruins of the castle at Eberleben. And once you see the traces that the Peasants' War has left in the landscape, you understand much more. And then I remembered that when I'd started work as a historian back in 1978, fresh from Australia and living in this tiny town of Blaubeuren, I had to cycle to the town of Ulm every day because that's where the archives were. And I used to cycle along the Danube River. And I never forgot that low route and watching the harvest come in and the changing seasons. And I had to finish my archival work in September because the bike path, which is now the Danube cycle path, had become impassable. And I realized that the seasons had got to be part of the book too. And I realized that I had to go to as many of the places of the Peasants' War as I could. And so I cycled from Strasbourg in Alsace to Constance, right down on the lake, and it was a distance of over 600 kilometers. And only then did I really understand how interconnected this whole region was. So no wonder the war affected it all. And then I also began to understand how the landscape had been shaped by human work. Just for instance, the hours of labor that it takes to maintain a vineyard. And so that's why I wanted the land itself to be an actor in the story of the Peasants' War. Have any of you been to Frankenhausen? Have you heard of the artist Werner Tübke?
Mm.
That is he produced what was at the time the biggest painting in the world. It's 14 meters high, 123 meters long, and it's on the battlefield, one of about a dozen battlefields in the Peasants' War. And I became convinced um, that the battlefield was really important and had to be part of the story of the book, just as the battlefields in Leipheim, Feldesheim, Baltringen, and so many other places need to be part of the story. And also from Tübke's magnificent panorama, he divides the Peasant War into the four seasons. And I took the idea of writing the book around the four seasons from that. Although the way I say a season began and end is slightly different from how he does it. And above all, I wanted the peasants to be the actors in this story. I've always been really irritated by the assumption that so many historians make that peasants are close to the land and so they're unchanging, they're naturally conservative, and they're not interested in ideas. Well, that just didn't seem to me to be the case. I think that peasants are constantly reacting to the market. Women take cheese, eggs, and poultry to sell in the towns. And so they're in the towns and at the marketplaces where all these Reformation ideas are being discussed.
Mm.
Peasants are doing things like they're trying out the new crops, like flax. They're interested in Reformation ideas and they had their own theology based on the idea of God's creation and their understanding of the Eucharist and the wine with which, as they saw it, Christ bought our freedom. And I wanted this story to be theirs. So the question I asked myself as a historian was, what did it feel like to be part of a movement like the Peasants' War? And why did people take that huge risk of rebelling against the Lords? Why would you risk everything you had, even your life? So to understand that, I had to understand the dreams of the peasants, and I had to work out what they did, where they went, and what they wanted. We have to remember that peasants weren't just one or two people living in isolated villages. They were the people.
Mhm.
90% of the population were farmers. Farming required a lot more people to do it. And even the people in the small towns, like those in Alsace, were often half peasants. They're vine workers, or they're people with their own animals or small pieces of land. And of course, it was a deeply religious world. So it must have been absolutely exhilarating to turn up in a group, hundreds strong, and demand admission to a monastery that you'd never been allowed to enter. And what happens? Suddenly the gates are opened. In the convent of Naundorf, they picnicked at the convent and ate a ton of cheese. And here, if we just look at the next one, oh, sorry, that's showing the route that I went right down to Alsace. And here we can see the vineyards that we went through. And that is the panorama monument on the battlefield at Frankenhausen. And let's go to and there's the view from that battlefield. You have an extraordinary view from up there, so you can see the land that you're fighting for. It's quite amazing space, amazing place to go to. And maybe the next one, that's the picture itself to give you a sense of it. And if we can have a look at the next, please. That is what is left of the convent of Naundorf. Just that. And that's where my peasants met, and I like to imagine them sitting there and picnicking. They ate a ton of cheese. And from the next one, let's have a look at the next. You can see from the perspective of the monks what happened. So this is another monastery, but you can see there that that's the monks' refectory, and you can see the peasants have invaded. You can see this peasant here with his peasant hat. He's taking over from the abbot, taking his place at table, and they're drinking the stores of wine and beer. And can we see the next one? Oh, sorry, we'll go back. They take his place at table, they drink the stores of wine and beer, and as you'll see, they fished the ponds dry. So, what are we dealing with, people here? What sort of people are these? Are they just are they just people who are ruffians, who are hell bent on wanton destruction? No, I don't think that that's what the peasants were doing. And I think, and if we can look at the next one, I would say that the peasants had three dreams. So the first dream is one of freedom. The second dream is one of is what I call a peasant theology, and the third is the idea of brotherhood. And I think that these dreams still speak to us now. And I called them dreams on purpose because I didn't want to think in terms of ideology, which was the way I'd been taught as a student. I'd been taught to think about having people and revolutions as having an ideology. And if you're going to have a revolution, you have to have an ideology. And somehow that didn't feel right for understanding the Peasants' War because I felt that the Peasants' War was powered by dreams and by a religious spirituality. And this was a group of people who mostly couldn't read and write. So if you just were looking for ideology, you wouldn't be giving them a voice. And so that's why I prefer to think of three key values that I see in the Peasants' War. Um, and the first value is that of freedom. And the third article of the Peasants puts it better than I ever could. And let me try and translate from the German here. As they put it, that Christ himself bought us all with his precious blood. He bought us free. The shepherd just as much as the highest person. No one is accepted. And that is why that scripture proves that we are free. And then they add this wonderful addition that we are free and want to be free. I just think that's a fabulous
Mm.
statement. And what the peasants are doing with that is they're taking an idea from the reformer Martin Luther that the laity should get communion in both kinds. They should get the wine as well as the bread. And they're linking that to this demand for freedom because it's precisely the wine with which Christ bought our freedom, the blood that lay people are not allowed to have. It's reserved to the clergy. And yet that's how Christ bought our freedom. So you can see what a very powerful claim that is and how inflammatory it was to link Luther's idea about communion in both kinds to the idea of freedom itself. But what did the peasants mean by it? Well, first, they meant freedom from bodily serfdom. No lord should be able to own them. Well, from the Lord's point of view, serfdom and owning your serfs was a way of securing your labor force. It prevented people from moving to town or moving off to another lord or another farm. It didn't mean that peasants couldn't become rich. Many peasants, too, were involved in trade, and they also grew crops for sale. But being owned by your lord is a humiliating status. And the other really interesting thing is that it has consequences for women's reproductive powers as well. The lord could insist, and many did, that you could only marry a serf of the same lord. Because the question arises, who owns your offspring? Is it the Lord who owned the woman, or is it the Lord who owned the man? And how's that going to get sorted out legally? So they insist you have to marry someone belonging to the same Lord. And if you don't, you'd have to pay a massive fine. And the reason for this is because, especially after the Black Death, the Lords wanted to secure the labour power of the next generation. And on top of that, many of the absolutely worst landlords who most insist on serfdom were the monasteries, the abbots and the abbesses. And they're the ones that insist on this, even though the church's theology is that marriage, and I think there's a picture of marriage on there might be a picture of marriage if we go down one. Yeah, this is a marriage of the Virgin, and it's a Jura woodcut. And I just took that because you can see that weddings actually happened until the Reformation at the church door. So they happen outside the church, and you can see how Dura's represented it because the sacrament consists in the free exchange of husband and wife, the free marital exchange, and sexual intercourse. And because that's the sacrament, and so this guy here is not marrying them, he's a witness to their sacrament of marriage. So there's Mary and Joseph marrying there. Um, and so if that's what the sacrament is, the free exchange of marital consent, your parents can't ban your marriage because you can promise the sacrament. That's what the sacrament consists in. So no one can say that you can't marry your partner, the person that you choose. So the church is saying that in its theological voice, and yet the very same churchmen, these monks and nuns, are restricting marriage choice. And effectively, what the Lords were trying to do was to possess women's reproductive power. So, where did the peasants get this idea of freedom from? Well, it too came from Luther because he'd written a wonderful pamphlet in 1520 called The Freedom of a Christian. And if you haven't read anything by Luther and you want to read just one thing, I'd recommend reading that, The Freedom of a Christian. And it's a wonderful, quite short treatise that's really, in many ways, quite unlike a lot of the rest of his writings. It starts with a simple paradox that a Christian is Lord of all, and yet a Christian is subject to all. And look at the word he's used in the title, freedom, the freedom of a Christian. And he used that word, whatever Lutherans like to say later. And even at the time, Luther was warned by his opponents that if he went on attacking authority in the church, the result would eventually be a peasant uprising. And of course, that's exactly what happened. But what did the peasants mean by freedom, and why did it mean so much to peasants in areas where there wasn't any bodily serfdom anymore? Did they mean individual rights? I don't think that that's what the peasants and all the rebels meant by it. And that's really interesting because their ideas are really quite different from those of, for instance, the English Civil War, where the parliamentarians worked with an idea of liberty for those who had property, who weren't servants and therefore weren't dependent on anyone. If you like, the free man. This model of freedom that you get in the English Civil War, the English Revolution, was male and depended on having property, and it wouldn't have included serfs. And of course, it was also intensely literary, as being part of a public that could read and write and form opinions. But the peasant ideal of 1525 was fundamentally collective, and it related to the Gemeinde, is the German word, the community. And it's a wonderful word, Gemeinde, because it's ambiguous as between congregation, so the religious community, and the political community. It means both. So, in that sense, it wasn't exactly about individual rights or human rights, it was fundamentally about groups. And in some ways, the peasant idea of freedom in 1525 was actually ahead of that of the English Civil War and even the French Revolution, because from the word go, it applied to slavery as well. For the peasants of 1525, freedom was connected to labor and to being properly paid, not forced to work. And the connection to slavery was actually evident to people at the time because when the theologians argued against them, what they did was argue that, well, look, the Bible and the New Testament was written in a slave-owning society. So slavery is just fine, and that means that serfdom is just fine as well. So as the rebels rejected that argument, and say it's not okay to say that just as Jesus accepted slavery, so serfs should accept being owned. When they're arguing against that, they're also arguing against slavery implicitly. And second, so let's move down to the, uh, so let's go down another one. Uh, yeah, that just gives you a sense of these village societies and what they're like. I love this image. It's actually a wedding that's happening. And can you see the husband and wife? There they are, there. And you can see the maypole that they're dancing around. You can see all kinds of things going on here. Someone's had a bit much to drink. And you can see all the couples dancing and the importance of the pub here and the church in the background. So let's go down one more. And that is the title page of Luther's The Freedom of a Christian, one of the many title pages because it was reprinted so often. And if we can go down one more. So the peasants had what I would call a peasant theology. And when I argued that, so we're now on point two, peasant theology. And when I used that word, I had trouble with my editors who thought that you couldn't dignify what peasants thought with the title of theology. But that was exactly what I meant, because I meant that peasants too were part of the Reformation and that they shaped it with their ideas. And just because we don't have theological treatises from them doesn't mean that they didn't have their own sophisticated spirituality. And that theology centered on creation. And it's the idea that God created the world, the birds in the air, the fish in the rivers, the woods, the waters, and the animals in the forest. And so, as they put it, he created all this free for, and it's the same word, only it's now with free for human beings to use. And it's a really interesting idea because it's not our ecological idea. On this view, creation doesn't have a value in its own right, independent of its use for human beings. Whereas, of course, an ecological approach, as we understand it now, would see nature as having value regardless of human beings. But what I think they are addressing here, and it's just, I think, really relevant today, is the issue of the fair division of resources. Because at that time, the lords were starting to control many of these resources. Wood and water were the main sources of power. Water ran the mills, while wood charcoal powered the smelters of the copper mines. And lords were insisting that they controlled access to the woods and were limiting what kinds of wood and where peasants might take timber from that they needed for their own uses. And at the time of the Peasants' War, the Forestry Administration and a whole bureaucracy dealing with the forests was just beginning because they were such an important resource for building. And you have to think of all the uses of wood. It's used for packaging, for heating. And if we go back just to look at that previous slide, sorry to ask you to go and back another one. Can you see there the fence at the back? That's made of sapling branches, and the village fence is what gives it a legal identity. It marks it out as a legal unit, and there's a peasant Gemeinde, a peasant body, which is a legal entity marked off by that sapling fence, and the saplings are bent downwards to create these fences. And you see, once you start seeing them, you see them everywhere. I think they're such a beautiful thing as well. And of course, people use twigs for the plaster that you see on the outside of the half-timbered houses. And water was another major grievance. Peasants weren't allowed to fish. And if we can go down a bit, um, and there is another of these fences. You can see it there again. These are some peasants that have had rather too much to drink, and go down another one. This, at Himmelpforte, the monastery's gone, but you can still see the line of the monastery's ponds, and they're still stocked with fish. So when the peasants and if we look at the next one, I think it is, here we can see it's the same chronicle, and we can see the monk's view of what happened, because the abbot of this particular monastery of Weissenau got an artist who was related to him to do a visual chronicle of what happened in the Peasants' War. So there's that bit where we saw the peasants invading the monks' refectory, and here we can see all kinds of things going on. And there are the ponds. And you can see there. Can we move to the next one? And then down one. There we can see how they're fishing out the entire pond. So they're taking the whole lot of the fish. And this guy here is actually raising the sluice gate. So all the water's going to flow out, leaving behind the fish, and making sure that there are absolutely no fish left for the monks. And indeed, you could say that the Peasants' War was a gigantic fishing trip. Absolutely everywhere. Peasants, often men and women together, took the right to fish into their own hands, often literally so, because they knew how to catch fish with their hands, which monks often don't know. And they went fishing and they washed it down with beer. And above all, they insisted on the right to hunt. So if we go down one more, which was reserved to the lords. And we can imagine the peasants' anger as the lords trampled over their fields in their pursuit of the hunt, or billeted their big hunting dogs on the peasants, making them, as one of them sort of put it, feel the lord's displeasure if the dog weren't in top condition. So, of course, they're having to give meat, which is a really precious protein resource for them, to the wretched dogs that are used in these massive hunts. And that the way that a hunt works is it's a massive sort of beating exercise, where the animals are just herded into a very small space. So they're calling for fair division of resources at a time before industrialization, before the exploitation of power had really taken off. And they wanted protection of the common lands that were used by all, and they wanted them that without the lord's infringement. And of course, they know the value of manure. So it's easy to see all this as just peasant truculence, but I think behind it lies an attitude towards fair use of God's creation and a
Hmm.
respect for not exploiting it too much. So let's go down one. And the third major value was that of brotherhood, Brüderlichkeit, or Bruderschaft, as you'd put it in the 16th century. And that comes out in the way the peasants addressed each other. They always call each other brother, and you would swear brotherhood in your village. And then how the Peasants' War worked was you swear brotherhood in your village, and then you send someone to the next village saying, "We have sworn brotherhood, and we invite you to join us and swear brotherhood. But if you don't come to us," they add, "we will come to you." And as one peasant leader put it, "and you won't be laughing." So it can work with threats as well as just the ideal of brotherhood. But threats alone, I think, would not explain the sheer numbers who joined. Because swearing brotherhood meant breaking your feudal oath. And the punishment for breaking your feudal oath is having the fingers with which you swore cut off, so that, of course, you couldn't work after that. Brotherhood meant leveling social status. So the peasants called on the lords to, the first thing they do is say, "Get off your horses and enter the ring," where they take counsel. So they take counsel in a big circle. And of course, the ring is a very democratic form because it's circular and nobody is the boss. And it's horses that make lords taller, and the lords' massive retinues of cavalry express their power. Everyone on the Lord's side remember one thing about Thomas Müntzer, the rebel leader. And what do they remember? They remember that he said that a prince should only have 8 horses and account 4. And time and again, they bring that up. You can see what an attack that is on their self-understanding. We might be going down one slide, I think. Um, Uh, yeah, you can see there a peasant on the peasant side opposed to the authorities of the church here, and you can see there the peasant's flail. So, from our perspective, brotherhood looks naive. The peasants thought they'd won when they got their own lord to swear brotherhood with them. And we can just imagine those lords grinding their teeth as they swore the oath. And many of them did, in fact, swear the oath of brotherhood to the peasants. But after the peasants' defeat, it didn't take long for them to break their oaths. "Brotherly love is out of fashion," there was one quip in Rothenburg, as one commentator saw someone being taken to prison. But what the peasants meant wasn't that there should be no lordship at all or that everything should be owned in common. What I think they meant by brotherhood was that relations between people should be fair and should be based on a kind of kinship, the idea that we're all dependent on each other and have mutual obligations. And of course, that idea is rooted in the way much of peasant farming worked in this period, because it's mostly strip fields where you have to agree what you plant and when, and where there's common land, and where the community as a whole hired shepherds who cared for all the animals, and where the peasants then collectively might demand the right to hire a preacher themselves as a community organization on the same terms and not have one imposed on them by whoever owned the benefice. So I can see you thinking, did brotherhood include women? Well, that's a big question. Perhaps women felt included by it, but I think that the Peasants' War as a military event wasn't a women's matter. They couldn't swear oaths, they couldn't bear weapons, they couldn't vote. But without their support, keeping the farms going and hiding the men afterwards, which was very important, and acting as fences for the stolen goods, without all of that, there would have been no Peasants' War. So brotherhood wasn't just about an emotional attitude, though of course it was that as well, but it was about the fair use of labour power, because, as the 12 Articles put it, the peasants were happy to work for their lord as he required, but the demands must be reasonable, timely, and they must be paid. So, in a time when many small farmers are being pushed out, and when and when we're seeing in our own time how supermarkets and a small number of producers are dominating the market, I think these are really helpful values to think about. So, what made the peasants feel able to take on the lords, even though they must have known the risk they were taking? And one thing has always struck me about the depiction of peasants, because in Western art, peasants are generally shown as squat, they're shown as short, boorish, stupid, and usually with open mouths. We all know the caricatures. But in the 1520s, they suddenly start being depicted as heroes. And the fighter for the Reformation is the evangelical peasant. And that's what we see here. And we see him with his jerkin and this peasant hat. And you may have noticed this peasant hat coming up quite a few times, and these peasant boots. Can we have a look at the next one? And there we see the evangelical peasant expounding the word of God with these fabulous boots. I'd really like a pair of boots like that. And you can see he's got his dagger here in his pocket. And it's a very all those items are strongly associated with who the peasant is. And for a brief moment, the peasant was in. And I think that part of the dynamism of the movement of 1525 derived from the anger at being ignored, treated with contempt, and not listened to. So I want to talk a bit in the time I have left, which I realize is not very long, is just to talk a bit about what it was like. I think none of us guessed how big the Peasants' War celebrations would be. I certainly didn't. I was amazed. I just had the most amazing year. I counted out the number of events I was involved in, and I got to 111. It was totally crazy. I found myself helping in an opera, which was performed in the Waldburg itself. I think there should be a slide of that if we go down one. I'll come back to this in a moment if we have time. So keep going. Um, yeah, that's a peasant opera. And if we go down one, it was performed in this castle. And it's a crazy castle, as you can see. It's owned by Truchsess Georg von Waldburg, who was the man whose army of the Swabian League, he commanded the Swabian League army, and he killed a whole lot of peasants in the region. So the first performance of the opera was, and it's a revived opera of 1975. It's a fantastic piece with fabulous music by Peter Janssens and a wonderful libretto by Jaak Karschunker. Really worth reading. Just a fabulous work of art. And Jaak Karschunker died very sadly, just a few months ago. He was into his 90s. So, if you can imagine just going down one, hearing the Bauernoper in this tiny castle, and then the next one, please. If you can imagine when the performance was over, being ordered by the castle administration that we had to pick up all the loose straws out of the gravel that had fallen out of the hay bales that we'd used in the performance. It was as if Rumpelstiltskin were happening all over again. So I met wonderful artists. If we go down one, I've eaten Thomas Münzer chocolates, and I go down one, been to a Midsummer Night's Picnic on that battlefield at Frankenhausen with white tablecloths and golden crockery and cutlery where we ate cherries, the next one off the trees. And we cut slices of the local bread in the fantastic local bakery. And this bread is called the Münzerleib or the Münzer body, the Münzer loaf. It's just completely bizarre. And of course, this picnic was organized by an artist. The interest in the Peasants' War was greater, I think, than anyone could have imagined in their wildest dreams. So I had an amazing year, traveling to as many events as I could, and I went to events in the former East as well as in the former West. And as someone who's an outsider, but who's spent many years living in Germany, I calculated this afternoon that I must have spent nearly 50 years living and working there. I'm struck by how different the celebrations were in the East and the West. And what really struck me more than anything else is how Thomas Münzer had largely fallen out of the celebrations. I didn't hear a single academic paper that discussed Thomas Münzer. Only one was given at a conference I was at, and I missed it, unfortunately. In Mulhausen, and if we see the next one, Tim Kregel has done, and so that's Münzer. There's Luther on here, and that's Thomas Münzer. We have no idea what he actually looked like. That's a 17th century imagination of what he might have looked like. If we go to the next one, Tim Kregel did a fantastic reconstruction of Albrecht Dürer's peasant column, the monument that we all thought that couldn't be built. We thought this is just a flight of fantasy. But if we look at the next one, we will see that it has actually been built. And this year it was erected in Mulhausen, the center of Thomas Münzer's activity. Wonderful though it is, of course, by putting that column there and using Dürer and the column as a way to celebrate the Peasants' War, you're not using Thomas Münzer, and you're not using him in the very place where he was. I think it was a really interesting decision. And indeed, in the Peasants' War exhibition in Mulhausen, a major exhibition, he mainly features in the reception part, not in the exhibition on the events themselves. And in Bad Schussenried, which was the other major exhibition, he's hardly there at all. There is a monument to him, if we go down one, where, and that, can we go in one more? Maybe I haven't got it on here. No, sorry, we'll have to go back up. If you're in if you're in Mulhausen, there is a monument. There are several monuments to Thomas Münzer that were put up during the DDR. And there's one in the place where his head was stuck up on a pike. And that is in the forest between Mulhausen and the village of Görmar. And the folk memory of that place goes right back to the 16th century. And Luther himself complained that a path had been worn to it. And he feared that Thomas Müntzer would become a popular cult. But if you go there now and try and find that place, um, there's no sign to it. And the 1920s monument, which was restored this year, isn't easy to find. And we had to use Google Maps to work out where it actually was. But in popular commemoration of the Peasants' War in the former East, Münzer is present everywhere. Artists make puns on his name. Georg Mann has created this wonderful thing, which he's called the Phantomas, because, like the cartoon figure of the Phantom, we don't know what Thomas Münzer looked like, and we credit him with extraordinary powers. I just think it's a wonderful work of art. And if we look at the next one, he's done a whole series of medals, including this one here. That's the Phantomas there in silver, and that's a deer and a thing that says no entry. So he's done some wonderful works of art that bring all this ambiguity into an artistic form. So artists are doing it, but what I miss is a real coming to terms with Münzer by other forms of popular commemoration and in history. Münzer is a difficult figure. Uh, his rhetoric is demagogic with its aggressive rhythms and his use of biblical inspired language to create a sense that only he is right. How could that rhetoric have been so admired in the West as well as in the East after the war, and why was there no allergic reaction to it? We need a critical engagement with this extraordinary mystic and his legacy. But I think that if we want a real understanding between the former East and the former West, we have to engage with the East German as well as with the West German narrative of the events. And that's why I really felt I had to write this book. So I'm going to stop there, unless you would also like to just have a look at the map of the destruction of convents and monasteries, which I can show you. If we move back to the map. This is what a group of us have created. We created a database. Yeah, that's it. I can't, I suppose I could try and see if I could show it to you live on my computer, but basically, see all those red symbols? We have a different symbol for each order. Everything that's red is a monastery or convent that was attacked. Everything that's black is one that wasn't. And you can see just how many were attacked and how it covers the whole region and just how amazing it was. And you can zoom in on each place and you can see how it works. So if we move down one, I just took a map of Esslingen. There's one of the institutions that was attacked. Here's another. And these two weren't, interestingly enough. And that's a town. Most of the monasteries and convents that get attacked are, of course, the ones in countryside. And if you move down one, that shows you Esslingen in its context, and you can see there how these convents and monasteries are scattered everywhere, and just how many attacks that there were. And what's really interesting about that is that no one had ever counted how many attacks on convents and monasteries there had been. It took us a long time to work it out, and we kept on finding more, and we still keep arguing about whether this one really was attacked or whether it wasn't. But we've come up with a figure of about 50% of the convents and monasteries that were attacked. And if you think that's 600, that's an enormous assault on monastic wealth. And so that's made us really rethink the significance of the Peasants' War, also in relation to think about the Counter-Reformation, because once you've seen that, you can see that when the Counter-Reformation happened, it was starting from a very low base after a lot of destruction. So I think seeing suddenly just how massive the Peasants' War was and how destructive it could be makes you also understand its role in history and its role in the Reformation in a new way. And so often the Peasants' War is treated as something apart from the Reformation. So I've gone on and on. Sorry for talking so much. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. That was totally inspiring. And you having all those your own experiences in there that just made it all. It just you just want to go really, and it's fantastic. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I also have a question. Did you find you found all these locations? Was that very difficult? Because maybe people and maybe between East and West, we know they're still very different. There are different ways of dealing with the peasant war. I'm sure there are. And that maybe it's more remembered in the East than in the West. And does that show in how you found the places, for instance, in terms of making it easier to find the places or not?
That's a wonderful question. There's been a huge amount of research that's gone into convents and monasteries. So there's a vast project that's gone on for, I think, well, over 100 years, of basically identifying all these monastic institutions in the area of what is now Germany. And that means that they all have their GIS locations. So we could use that to create the map. And the database then translated fairly easily into a map. It takes months of work to create the database and then months of work to input it all. And then suddenly you have a map and it's just extraordinary. You understand it differently. And I went around Germany with the map. So, for example, with that convent of Naundorf, it doesn't exist. That's all that's left of it. I could see from the GIS map that I had, that one that we made, I could see where I was. And so I could navigate towards where I thought the convent of Naundorf must be. And that's how I found that wall. I just think it was just such fun. But for places that are well known, like somewhere like Funkenhausen, yes, you're absolutely right. The way that commemoration was approached was very different. And it was different in the West from what it was in the East. And I've been thinking about that a lot over the year. And I would say that whereas in the West, the Peasants' War is very much seen, so that's the former Federal Republic. In the West, the Peasants' War is very much seen as a local event and it's part of local history. So it's an inspiration for people who see a local democratic tradition and who come out in particular of movements around 1968. And the commemorations are very local, and the Peasants' War is seen as something that you celebrate locally. Whereas in the former East, in the Democratic Republic, in the former communist Germany, it was seen as a national event. So its significance was national as well. And that's come out in the way it was celebrated. Interestingly enough, in the West, I would say it was still local. Very little was done in northern Germany, very little was done in Berlin, but amongst areas that belong to the heartlands of the former East, it is absolutely seen as a national event with national significance. And just understanding those two different conceptions of history has been fascinating.
Very interesting. So we have a lot of people having their hands up. First person I have is David Parker.
Oh,
David.
wow.
Yeah, David Parker.
Hello, David.
Is he here?
Hi, Lyndal.
Oh, very good.
Hi.
Thank you
How
so
lovely to see you.
thank you so much. That was brilliant. It was really made me feel 20 years younger. Um, when when I was teaching a special subject on popular uprisings in France, much later, of course, one of the questions for the students that they had to tease out from the literature, which was often divided on this point, was the question of leadership. Did the peasants have their own leaders, produce their own leaders, or were they to any extent dependent on people from outside their own ranks? How do you see that in your case?
I would say it's probably a similar mixture. Very often you get people acting as leaders who are from maybe a nearby town, people who can read and write, people who have some military experience, even lower nobility. So sometimes it does follow local hierarchies, but sometimes it also doesn't. And people who um, are uh, richer peasants, yes, but who are not people who would ordinarily have taken this kind of role, take it on. And so I was interested also in trying to think not just of leaders, but of how a whole movement comes together and how people move as part of a group. And so that's why I got interested in tracing where the peasants went. So that I wanted to move away from just thinking about leaders, but to try and think about collectives.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Jacob Winchell. Is Jacob Winchell here? No, no. Okay. John Clement. John
Um, I,
Clement.
I put my questions in the chat.
Ah,
If you
okay.
want,
Let me just ha flag it up. Do you, let's have a see. Okay. Well, actually, Jacob Winchell asked why were those monasteries which were not
Oh,
attacked?
yeah, brilliant
Oh,
question. Um, uh, and there's a long answer to it, which will probably bore you. That we're really interested in why some weren't. Sometimes it's just quite simple. If you think about where there are most ecclesiastical institutions, they're in towns. And they will often they'll be ecclesiastical centers, so they might have 8, 10, even a dozen monasteries or convents. And it's very difficult for peasants to take over a town. So that also means that even in the cases where they do manage to take over a town, and bear in mind they can't take over the bigger ones because they just don't have that kind of person power. And once a town is over a certain level of rich, it can hire mercenaries, which will mean that peasants certainly can't get in there. So um, the figures, the total of monastic institutions is inflated by the large number in towns. And even when they start attacking institutions in towns, they tend not to do the lot because some of them are very poor. They'll do one or two. So partly, a lot of institutions aren't attacked because they're in towns and they weren't really possible targets. So that's part of the explanation. Part of the explanation, too, is that the richer ones tend to get particularly attacked. And they are also the ones which are the really worst landlords. And that's where you also see a lot of destruction, including the burning of libraries and documents, because those documents include the documents around serfdom and dues that have to be paid. So, of course, peasants are very hostile to those documents, and they're hostile to books because they contain the Latin liturgies in many cases, and they don't want church services in Latin. So it's not just mindless destruction. So there are some areas where, and there are bits around Baden, what is today Baden-Württemberg, where we see a number of convents and monasteries that aren't attacked. Interesting, we've puzzled about that as a group. I think it's partly to do with the nature of the Peasants' War in that area, which is much more confused and involves Duke Ulrich of Württemberg and other struggles. So there's no one explanation overall, and my suspicion is that that 50% is an underrepresentation of the significance of the phenomenon, partly because of the inflation of the figures by places in towns, and partly because we still don't know all the places that were attacked. If a place was attacked and then secularized by Protestant rulers later, as many of them were, there's no ongoing historical tradition and there's no ongoing chronicles. And that sometimes means if there wasn't a local chronicler, we just don't know.
thank you
thank
very
you.
much. I can't, John Clement, I can't find you. I can't see what you asked. Could you ask it again?
Oh, I haven't put anything in the chat. I just got my hand up.
Oh,
So,
oh yeah, okay. Well, do you want to speak?
uh, yeah, well, thank you. Um, yes, so I'm reminded of so many things. I'm quite overwhelmed, really. I really enjoyed listening to all of that. And I used to live in Waldenburg for some years, a few years ago. So I'm familiar with the peasants' defeat at Borblingen in 1525, with the feudal Swabian overlords had a victory. Also reminded of the bike rides through that region. So you really took me back to all of that. I have a question, which I'm not sure that it's like at the heart of what you're trying to say. But I'm wondering, this revolt, of course, we've talked about how it precedes the French Revolution. It precedes so much, and of course, obviously, it precedes the 19th century and industrialization and so on. I'm wondering to what extent we've got grievances here that are political, economic, social, theological. Um, to what extent do you see these revolts or this collective activity to what extent do you see this as actually kind of psychological and evolutionary? You know, it's something that is actually part of being human. So it's not being organized. It's simply a kind of mass instinctive impulse that if your self-determination is under threat, if your dignity is under threat, if your autonomy is under threat, if your dignity is compromised or any kind of restriction, that actually this is the grounds, whether it's actually spiritual or temporal in terms of its aim or objective, that actually there is a need to resist oppression. I mean, it occurs to me that this meeting we're gathered here today in the name of the organization which is running the meeting. So clearly there must be some kind of overriding principle, but it's clearly preceding Marx. And I'm just wondering how you would characterize or color or describe this revolt. I'm also thinking in terms of a number of anarchist historians who disagree about the significance of the German Peasants' War. Whether you have people like James Joel, for example, he talks about, yes, it's a resistance, but he's not quite sure how radical it is or how kind of anarchist or socialist it is. Whereas you have other historians who are quite happy to say, oh, yeah, this is part of a timeline, a network, a trajectory, which suggests that a revolt and resistance to authority is a natural, instinctive, humane quality. So that actually we should be thinking about liberation. Liberation is natural. We don't need to be oppressed. So I'm just wondering, Lyndal, how you would personally describe it. Is it natural, psychological, and instinctive, or is there something more that's going on here?
I think that I would want to see many levels at work, and um, I, I think human relationships have many aspects. So I think it is economic. A lot of it is about access to resources. A lot of it is about not being paid. But I think you put your finger on another dimension of it, which I think is really important, the sense that you're not being treated with dignity, that you haven't got autonomy. And that's why I find it quite helpful to think about peasant theology, because I think that's the way in which they thought. And theology is about relations between human beings and values and relations with the environment and with God. And if one thinks about it that way, then of course economics is part of it. And of course, the land is part of it, and resources are part of it. And I suppose where I think that where I found I had to rethink some of my views about what makes a revolution is when I realized that this is an understanding of ecology in the sense of human beings' relationship to the resources and environment. And once you see it that way, where we look now, we have quite a narrow understanding what a revolution should be about and what issues it should be addressing. Whereas if you suddenly think, well, what is it like to live in a society before there were the ideas of property owning that we have now, before there was industrialization, when resources were thought about differently? I think that then opens up new ways of thinking and it broadens our sense of what a revolution can take on. And I think that's what I was wanting to do. And that's also why I wanted to talk about dreams and why brotherhood seemed so important. I wouldn't say it wasn't organized. I wouldn't say it was instinctive, because to run, I mean, just in sheer terms of what they did and how far they walked and how they communicated with one another, that is just amazing organization. If you think in a world before there were easily passable roads, how did they, before there's email, before there's, I mean, there's a letter system, but not everyone can read and write. It's the lords who've got a whole system of running lordship. They've got the horses. They can move much more quickly. If you haven't got their sort of horses, how do you communicate? I just think the organization involved is really impressive. And it's organic. It works by taking one community and then swearing brotherhood with the next. So it's incremental. And the way it works is really fascinating because you start with these small bands, then you get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it seems that there's an upper limit of about 6 to 10,000 because once an army gets bigger than that, you can't provision it. You can't provision it by raiding the convents and monasteries. And I think that's why you get a number of armies, which in the end don't come together because that just wouldn't have worked, and why they reach a point where they have to take on the lords. And of course, as soon as you reach a situation where there's a pitched battle, that's when disaster happens.
Thank you so much. Could we have David Morgan next to ask or speak to us?
Oh, hello, David.
Lyndal, great talk. It's wonderful to have. I think we had over 100 people logged on at the start.
Yeah.
That's amazing for medieval history. Well, we can call it maybe early modern history, but it's certainly earlier than the period we normally cover. And the number of questions, lively questions, and there's still more people wanting to ask questions. I'm really happy because I wanted to do this talk since I saw the book. I think I saw the same review that Greta saw in the LRB. Then I bought the book. One question I wanted to ask you: you talk about cycling around, and you mentioned you go to this place. I think it's actually in France called Lupstein. It sounds German, but I think it's in France now. And you see this ruined church where you describe seeing skulls and bones still exposed. How can that? Can you say something more about that? And also, one other question was relating to the attacks on the convents and the monasteries. Did they treat the women obviously in the convents differently from how they treated the monks in the monasteries? Was there any kind of difference in how, I'm assuming people, I can think lurid things that might have happened. But anyway, over to you.
Look, seeing Lupstein was really shocking. To see it, we had to sort of make a diversion off the main cycle route, and then as you cycle along the canal, you can see Lupstein in the distance because it's got a slight hill. And of course, the church has been completely destroyed. But what happened in that town was the peasants had all fled there, and you can see why, because it sticks up and it looks like it'll be safe and secure, and the church is in the middle. And they all gathered in the church, and then the soldiers set fire to the village on all four corners. and the flames reached the church. The men, by this point, put up their hats at the church windows. And again, the hat is so important, the peasant hat. They put it up at the windows as a sign of surrender, but it was too late. And everyone in the church was burnt to death. So it's a modern church. It's not that church that was there. And I thought there wasn't anything there until I went around the side and there's an ossuary. And in that ossuary was just a heap of skulls and bones. Really quite extraordinary. I hadn't expected to come face to face with that. In the rest of the Peasants' War, there aren't that many human remains that we know about and have in museums at the moment. So there are 6 skeletons that were found near Leipheim. So they were found at the petrol station, just near the petrol station. One of them may be a woman, and those skeletons have been examined, and that's interesting. There's one that is in the a couple that are in the museum in Frankenhausen, and you can see a hole in one of in the skull. What hasn't happened is we haven't had a full-scale excavation of somewhere like Frankenhausen. And I know an archaeologist who's dying to do it and who has a sense of where he wants to dig. So the kind of battlefield archaeology that has been done for the Battle of Lutzen has not been done yet. I don't know whether anyone's seen the Battle of Lutzen Museum. It is the most extraordinary museum I know. You go in, and what they did was dig out an entire mass grave. And instead of taking the bones out of it, they excavated the whole mass grave as a block, and they've erected it as a block. So you can see how the corpses were placed. And over the top of all the corpses, there's a figure with outstretched arms in the shape of a cross. Really quite extraordinary thing. But that is the work that hasn't been done. For Lutzen, we can tell you what the soldiers' diets were. We can even give you a personal history of everyone whose bones are there, what they ate, where they came from, what wounds they died of. It really is absolutely extraordinary what the team has done there. And that's the battlefield at Lutzen. And that's the archaeologists at Halle under Harald Meller. Quite amazing feat.
Absolutely fascinating. We could just go on all night, I think. We have David Margulis next, and then we're going to read there's some text questions here. David Margulis, please.
Thank you. I've found this fascinating, but one thing I thought it would be useful mentioning. Elizabethan fiction doesn't pay very much attention to anything that happens on the continent, but Thomas Nash, one of the most important writers of the period, has a long section of the unfortunate traveler on the peasant revolution. And he's not generally sympathetic to people being mistreated, but the sense of soldiers who are well armed slaughtering peasants who only had their agricultural tools was, I thought, something very unusual for him, and must have been very unusual for the time as well.
Thank you very much for that. I'd forgotten that, and I'll go back to Thomas Nash and read that again. I think it was shocking at the time, and I think the sense of well, I mean, I could talk for hours about the Dürer monument. I don't agree with Stephen Greenblatt's interpretation of it as a celebration of victory. Quite the opposite. I think it is a tragic monument. And I think generally people were really shocked by the amount of killing that went on and the sheer mismatch between, I'd said that 6 soldiers on the authority side perished at the Battle of Frankenhausen, and it was somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 rebels who died. So you get Luther's friends writing to him and being really appalled at the kind of line he's taking. And I think there are monuments that the lords who won put up, and I'm finding more and more of them, and they're absolutely fascinating. There's one in on the marketplace in Mainz. I don't know whether anybody's seen that one. It's a fountain. It presents the peasants as drunken oafs, and of course, it's the fountain on the marketplace where the peasants would have had to go up to get water, and they would have had to pass that insult as they went there. Um, but others not on the Lord's side, I think, don't think it's okay. And the whole memory of the war, I think, is very, very interesting, and the kind of suppressed ways in which this comes out in other forms, like the fact that a path is worn to where Thomas Munzer's head was exhibited on a spike.
Fascinating. We have Richard Myers asking, what was Luther's response to the Peasants' Rebellion?
Well, his response is that Luther's response builds. So at first, when there seems to be a truce, he writes something on the Peasants' 12 Articles, and he says, you lords should behave better. And this is all happening because you haven't introduced the Reformation. And you peasants, and then he goes on a diatribe about how they should never revolt. So he's appearing to be even-handed. He's setting himself up as an authority, but he's not actually even-handed at all. Then, after the incident at Weinsberg, where 24 nobles were killed in pretty much cold blood, Luther changes the strength of his reaction. And bear in mind that he's also got a complex political situation because his own ruler, Frederick the Wise, is insisting on negotiating with the peasants. He doesn't want to use military force against them. Frederick the Wise is on his deathbed at this point, and his brother who's going to succeed him, takes a different line. But it's a very tricky position for Luther at this moment. And then when he does come out against the peasants, he writes this terrible short pamphlet. It's one of the shortest things he writes, and he basically says, stab them, kill them, like it's like how you have to deal with a mad dog. Stab them because a mad dog will kill you. And he says that killing peasants is all work that's pleasing to God. So it's a very shocking pamphlet, and many of his friends were appalled by it. So they tried to get him to write a retraction. He writes a retraction in which he comes out even more strongly against the peasants. And of course, it's not a surprise that Luther doesn't support the peasants, even though if you look at their ideas, nearly all of them are in Luther. He doesn't support them because the accusation that has been made from the very beginning is, if you go on like this, Luther, there will be a peasants' uprising. So he has a lot of maneuvering to do, because that was the attack that was made on him by the conservatives from the word go. And I think also, if you look at his background, he wasn't the son of a poor miner. He was the son of a mine owner. So he's part of that elite, which has to do with the lords. The mine lease is dependent on the local ruler. So of course, that's where Luther's sympathies are with the established order.
Thank you. What I'll do now, there's quite a few other things in the comments, and I don't know if we can address everything so beautifully and elaborately, but I'll read out here Karim Kan Yildirim. Could you, and I read then some of the other ones as well, which they may overlap. Could you elaborate a little on the problematic relation between Lutheran reformism and Münzer-led rebellion? Could the fact that Münzer or radicalism in general was downplayed in official commemorations have something to do with the fact that the AfD has become the biggest party by far at some of the most significant battle scenes? So that's an interesting one. Is there, and then Steve Jeffries to everyone, is there any evidence of misogyny in the sacking of convents in comparison with monasteries? That somebody raised that already. And then I think there's more. Here is the red line. Oh, wait a minute. Here's I have to go up and down here. This that, and then there is, did the peasants, Gordon Scobie, did the peasants change their strategy over time in response to actions of the landowners, aristocracies, forces of the state? And somebody who hasn't, Jacob Winche, we've had him on another question, but here's Richard Holland. And who did the catering? Michael Gallagher, what are your impressions of Ernst Bloch's book on Münzer? Interesting one. Jim Ritchie, I want to mention another book, The Time of the Harvest, has come by Martin Empson, published by Bookmarks, publication 25. And Richard Holland says, who did the catering? He says it was a joke. That question was a joke.
Oh, it's not a joke. It's a really serious
Not really.
thing.
It's an interesting one.
Oh, it's really, I was fascinated by that. And I think the answer is how it works is it's sort of outdoor barbecues. So how it often works is that a monastery or convent or a lord will say, here, have so many cattle, and then they slaughter them and then they roast them outside and or they steam them, but that's quite difficult to do because you need big vats to steam things in, which they sometimes manage. So how people cooked is really interesting and really important because that's one of the ways in which you create a group sense and a group loyalty. So not a stupid question at all, not a joke.
It's a very important question for all of us.
Yes,
And
yes.
here is Darwin's swept Germany in a way, perhaps not dissimilar to the way the November Revolution of 1918 did. Similar dynamics?
Interesting.
I think that, yeah, I think we've covered all the little comments that have been here. So, yeah, we've got the book and so on. So maybe if you would like to do some final concluding words for this wonderful, wonderful exploration. Everybody's going to go away and travel to these places now and have a look and see how to eat that marvelous bread that you had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, go to Frankenhausen and get a meat
Yeah.
pipe. They are wonderful questions. I mean, the question about the AfD and whether that's playing a role. Oh, look, that's such a big question. And you're absolutely right. It is key to all of this. And it concerned which politicians spoke where and who didn't get invited to speak where and why. What I And yet I still feel positive about this because even in the areas where the AfD is very strong, there are still so many people who are appalled by the AfD. So what you're seeing is a really divided Germany. And what I found cheering was that although the AfD tried to use the Peasants' War, I don't think that worked. And they did things like they did they got a farmers movement to present sort of modern 12 articles, which were all about we don't want any restrictions on the amount of pesticide and fertilizers we can use. We don't want any more green interference. And it was all presented as freedom for the peasants. that didn't gain traction really beyond a certain point. And I didn't think that the AFD, I mean, a few years ago, it looked like that with tractor marches and with the use of the peasant boot, you might get a sort of um, co-option of the Peasants' War by the AFD, but I don't think that happened. And I think that's because so many people organized events in their own way to make sure that would not happen. And I think you can see how important this event is to people because it's also part of their pasts. Everybody in the former East knows about Thomas Müntzer. There were over 600 streets named after him in the former East Germany. And he was taught on the school curriculum. He really is part of people's past. And so the whole thing was, in a way, a cipher for the difference between East and West. And that's why the celebrations were so important. On misogyny, that's the flip side of brotherhood. You're absolutely right. I would say, though, that though from the nuns' point of view, the way they talk about the peasants is always in terms of the threat of rape and the threat of being invaded. In fact, there isn't evidence of peasants raping nuns, and I think we would know about it if they had, because that's what the authorities would have said. There is a lot of evidence for the soldiers raping women, especially in Alsace, where there were really shocking scenes, and a lot of chronicles talk about that. There is certainly a lot of insults of nuns and a lot of insults of elite women. That currency of insult is really misogynist and is really part of the Peasants' War. But that's not the same as raping people. Whether peasants change their strategy over time, wonderful question. The trouble is, though, that the whole thing, really, the actual active phase of the Peasants' War, only lasts 2 to 3 months. So they can learn quite a bit, but in a space of that's that brief. And that's the other thing about this, all that killing in such a short time. It isn't really possible to learn a lot of lessons. You can see that they're able sometimes, like Hans Müller is a really fabulous tactician and he manages to get hold of the key site opposite Freiburg. But he, in the end, is not able to keep going. And they certainly do know to go for arms stashes and to take those. So they're not unarmed. And they do learn a bit, but the thing that they don't change is this use of the wagon castle and defending that. And that's a tragic thing because as soon as they get first the shot hitting them and then a cavalry charge, they break ranks, and that's when they're exposed and they just get slaughtered. I don't have anything interesting to say on Ernst Bloch, but you should read Andy Drummond's biography of Thomas Müntzer. That is fabulous. And interestingly, it has not been translated into German, although we've made attempts to do so. I think that really needs to be translated.
Marvelous. Well, thank you ever so much. What a wonderful evening. We were all wanting to have more peasant information and see the places and so on. And it's also interesting to see it in the context of all the farming demonstrations that we have in France, Belgium, I mean, Germany, huge, absolutely massive demonstrations. People are abroad and very angry because I mean, I feel very much for the peasants because we need food, we need to eat. And why destroy people's lives with the Mother Earth? That is totally crazy. And then import genetically engineered food. So I think we are at the minute in a huge crisis with our relationship with the earth and with the soil that we should grow food out of. And it doesn't seem to fit with a lot of people who are into the green movement. I mean, how are they helping? I don't know. They're somewhere else. Strange things, but there are a lot of stuff anyway. There's so much going on for us right now. So I would like to thank you awfully. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to us. And I'm sure everybody wants to clap their hands and agree with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
It's
thank
just
you.
great to have the
Yeah.
chance to talk to you.
Lovely. Thank you. And bye-bye. Bye now.